It's The World This Week, 7 days, 4 Paris-based correspondents, 1 hour. The World This Week in partnership with the Daily Beast foreign editor, Christopher Dickey, is with us. How are you, sir?
Glad to be here.
Glad to have you. Glad to have as well James McCauley, Paris correspondent for the Washington Post. How are you?
Great. Thanks for having me.
All right. He's formerly of the Wall Street Journal. Freelance reporter Inti Landau is with us. Nice to see you.
Good evening.
And France24.com senior editor Lila Jacinto is gracing us with her presence. How are you?
Good to be back.
The World This Week on Facebook and Twitter, the hashtag World This Week. He ran as an isolationist, but when it comes to Afghanistan, Donald Trump's generals have convinced him to do an about-face and announce, well, you could call it a mini-surge between 3,500 and 5,000 U.S. troops.
My original instinct was to pull out, and historically, I like following my instincts. But all my life, I've heard that decisions are much different when you sit behind the desk in the Oval Office. So I studied Afghanistan in great detail and from every conceivable angle.
Christopher Dickey.
Well, that would have been more convincing if he hadn't talked about the Prime Minister of Afghanistan, because if he'd studied it from every angle, he would have realized there is no Prime Minister of Afghanistan. There's a President of Afghanistan, but that's just a little thing. In the big picture, he talked about it as if it was the Mayweather-McGregor fight. I'm going to go in, I'm going to win, and we're not going to take anything except a victory. But it's not like that kind of fight. It's been a very long haul. It's been 16 years, although he said 17 years. And it's going to go on and on and on. Basically, he's opened the door to endless war. And he really did not talk about the general context for this war, something that actually gets covered far too little. Nobody, nothing in his speech anyway, looked at the borders of Afghanistan and how that fits into the question of Afghanistan and Pakistan. He mentioned India. He said, we're going to side with India. Somehow that's going to help. When in fact, Pakistan's great worry, its whole reason for being in Afghanistan, is to stop India from interfering.
But hang on, he speaks after firing Steve Bannon, his isolationist advisor. The generals around him and his defense minister know Afghanistan well.
Well, not well enough, it seems. I mean, what they are saying to him is, if we have a few more troops, we can really turn this around. But what are they talking about? They're talking about 4,000 troops. We don't know what kind of troops those are going to be. Let's say it's 4,000 special operation forces. They're going to go in, they're going to kill some Taliban, they may take some territory back. How are you going to hold that territory? Afghanistan and Pakistan, they have particular kinds of interests. China has an interest there, huge economic interest there. Iran is a major player there, and India could be a major player there, wants to be a major player there, which is exactly what Pakistan doesn't want. This is an incredibly fraught environment. It's going to be an endless war. And that is what a lot of people knew.
When you look at this map, what are your thoughts thinking back to what Donald Trump said, Lila Jacinto?
Well, I mean, this region has always been what it is. And after 9/11, we saw all these powers sort of come together, and that has now been dissipated. Russia and China. Russia seems to be aiding the Taliban. The region is never going to change. And, what I am seeing is, I mean, Trump obviously was just a spokesperson, a mouthpiece for his generals. But I actually do not, I think it's a pretty good strategy because, I mean, if you look at what went wrong in Afghanistan. From the start, Pakistan was not tackled. Then the resources went into the Iraq war. Obama comes in 2009, and he gives a timeline for when to get out. The Taliban sits it out. The peace process that's supposed to be starting has gone nowhere because Afghans understand force, as do the Taliban. And if the tide is changing, Afghan civilians have to continue living there. So all this, I think it is a good strategy because there's not a single Afghan that I've spoken to, including the ones who are not really for the U.S. troops, who thinks that any pullout, should have been done.
16 years, Leila. 16 years. We've been training the Afghans to take over the war. They haven't been able to do it. Not close. Not even close.
But what happened, Chris, is the people who are criticizing this are precisely the people in the AFPAC circles in the U.S. who have been advising the U.S. from the start. A singular lack of what should I say, ambition, never taking on Pakistan, always saying that...
Well, take on Pakistan. How are you going to resupply the troops in Afghanistan if you take on Pakistan? Everything comes in through Karachi.
This is true, but Pakistan has blocked access to Afghanistan.
Yeah, but mostly they don't block access. If we take the direction that Trump is describing, they will block access. They will get deeper in bed with China, as you well know. And we haven't even talked about what Iran and Russia are going to do.
Well, Pakistan and China have always been close. Now...
So where is our dog in this fight, Leila?
Because what's going to happen is we've lost the Iraq and Syrian heartlands, and, there are jihadists who are going to come home. And trust me, this is a region...
What does that have to do with Afghanistan?
Because as we always know, whenever we talk about not intervening, and I understand that, it becomes a free-for-all for jihadis, and then we pay the price.
But the Taliban are already on the roll. They keep gaining territory. That's not because we're pulling out.
As does ISIS. And the Taliban are not in any state to... I mean, we're seeing an attack by ISIS right now. 3 years ago, 4 years ago, I was reporting on Daesh in Afghanistan, and everybody who basically wants to pull out was saying...
So would you suggest that we occupy Afghanistan?
No, we don't.
Well, then what are we going to do? If we can't depend on them to do it, then what are we going to do?
Also, the Afghan security forces, this is another thing that the media keeps doing. Obviously they're not up to the standard of U.S. forces, but they have developed their capacity. And
no, it's not whether they're up to the standard of U.S. forces. They're not up to the standard of the Taliban forces. That's the problem.
It's not that difficult to decimate the power of the Taliban. You've got to... They're also equipping the Afghan Air Force. You've got to give them the chance. And I can see
16 years we've been giving them the chance.
I've been reporting this conflict for more than 16 years. What I can see is the elite troops in Afghanistan, they really are trained. So this... Also, just one more thing, this whole business about capacity building and state institutions. What's happening is you have the Pentagon and you have the State Department. And the State Department is sort of vested in, this democracy building. The Afghans, they have a government right now. We can aid them. We can, arm twist them. But we don't need capacity building. You can't have a government functioning at capacity when they don't have security.
Yeah, what I was wanting to say is that on the domestic front, I think, like you were saying, Donald Trump is making a big mistake because this is not a war you can win. It's basically the situation you could try to achieve is to get the Afghan government keeping peace in its own country, and the U.S. would be able to leave. So whatever is the way you look at it, it's never going to be a victory for the U.S. and pouring more means in it won't resolve the thing in the short term.
Well, I mean, this graveyard of empires thing. What you need is the Taliban to come to the table. Believe me, when you have fighters in a country which has had 30 years of war, they understand force. You get them into the table. So it's not a question of, what is your success?
Where's the force, Leila? 4,000 troops? That's nothing.
He didn't say 4,000 troops.
No,
These
that
are
was
the reports
the briefing.
that's coming
No,
up.
that's the briefing from White House staff to reporters. The background briefing was 4,000 troops.
I mean, you've got to maintain control of this place because...
And you're going to do that without occupying it, right?
There is a government in place.
Well, but you have bombings every week in mosques in the country, and that's the...
Well, what we had, in a way, we did have troops in Afghanistan. We had troops, but we were sending mixed messages. It was not like we were going to pull out of Afghanistan in any shape or form. How long will this end? That is, of course, an issue, but it's in the long haul.
James McCauley, your thoughts on where it's going to go now? Because
yeah, I mean, I think, this is not my beat, but from my perspective, perhaps the most interesting question, from an American standpoint on this is, what does the president's decision or remarks the other day mean for American foreign policy in the Trump era? And will it, in fact, be significantly different from the foreign policy that we have had for years now? And, in the relative brevity of the Trump administration to date, there's been much remarked on about, the, like you used the word isolationism before, the so-called shift, in the American presence overseas, which, there is a lot to say about that too. But, this is one of the, this is a sort of an early and kind of major plot point, I would say, in the Trump presidency. And you wonder, like, with a decision like this, the forever war will continue for the time being. And in the long run, how different will this presidency end up being in that sense?
Final question on this. Christopher Dickey, would you have cheered if Donald Trump had kept his campaign promise and, pulled out?
I would have said that'll lead to a lot of problems, but at least it won't lead to a lot more American deaths. And it won't open the door to endless war for the United States. I don't think that this administration is capable of dealing with the diplomatic or the military issues that surround Afghanistan, and I think that his statement made that absolutely clear.
We're going to move on. It's still very raw and very early days when it comes to piecing together last week's attacks in Catalonia that left 15 dead and scores injured. On Thursday evening, there were tributes on Barcelona's famed Ramblas, as well as a memorial service right near where a van mowed down pedestrians. What we already know is that it could have been much worse. It seems, Inti Landauer, that it was all precipitated by the explosion of this bomb-making factory near the French border. You were in Barcelona last week.
Yes, I was on holiday there. Yeah. And I ended up covering and reporting from La Ramblas. Yes.
We've covered unfortunately, similar stories a lot over the last 3 years. What did people in Spain make of this?
As anywhere else in Europe, people are first flabbergasted. I mean, it's difficult to explain why you would kill innocent people walking on the street, tourists. It's difficult to fathom for tourists or just people who are just hanging out in a commercial part of a big city. But then you find out all the same reactions, the flowers. People are trying to advocate for peace and reconciliation. It's difficult for the people in Barcelona as it was for the people in Paris. You were there too?
Yes, and I think on that note, there are some similarities and some important differences with some of the other like immediate aftermaths of the attacks that we have all recently followed far too frequently, unfortunately. And in terms of similarities, one thing that that really strikes you is the way in which the regional politics of the community struck, in particular, can manifest themselves in the security domain, really importantly. And that was an issue with Brussels, where you have
a weak central authority.
Exactly. Well, in fact, like in Brussels, you have this like truly like multifaceted security system, these like little autonomous police forces that don't necessarily share information with each other that well or that frequently. And here you have Catalonia, this autonomous region, and Spain, and what in our reporting, what we we learned like details which such as like the imam of the small town in Ripoll, who is suspected as having been the sort of nexus of this terror plot. When he came to Ripoll, the mosque authorities did everything correctly. They did a background check on him, but with the Catalonian authorities, and the Catalonian authorities, as it turns out, did not have access to like sort of Europol data that had sort of a previous history of his convictions, which Spain had. And so this is the same Brussels story of this sort of, and today, you had in the Financial Times, the regional president of Catalonia accusing Spain of playing politics with the security issues.
It should be said we're coming up to a referendum
exactly,
on independence
in October,
for Catalonia.
And that's on the other side, sort of using the Spanish against the whole thing. So
we're talking about his name is Abdelbaki S. Sati, and he set up shop in this town of Ripoll near the French border in Catalonia. This after beating a deportation order back to Morocco, despite serving hard time for transporting more than 120 kilos of hash. It's in jail that he got to know one of the 2004 Madrid bombers. And before being accepted as imam in Ripoll, Saty tried his luck in a suburb of the Belgian capital, Brussels.
Yes, yes.
Which, by the way, not just a suburb that's almost adjacent to Brussels Airport, as it happens.
Yes, yes.
And one that's been known for a long time as a hotbed of Islamist organizing. So, yeah. But in fact, there's a report in ABC from which is one of the major papers in Barcelona today, that says, in fact, Saty's record of involvement with jihadis goes back much further than his incarceration for hashish. It goes back at least to 2005, when the Spanish authorities tapped his phone because they thought he was part of a logistic network that was actually connected to the people who had blown up the Atocha rail station in Madrid, killing 192 people in 2004.
Which brings us back to the question that Inti heard from people in Barcelona, which is people surprised, flabbergasted, yet should their radar have been up when you think back to the fact that there was the precedent of Madrid?
It should have been up. And also with Saty, you know, this is an imam who has faced a conviction for drug charges because, you know, once again, we are seeing these same patterns and these links with these European jihadist groups, criminal networks, you know, and these imams who make themselves overnight imams. And the Muslim community did flag this off. You know, imams of other mosques found him suspicious, and he was reported to the authorities. This somehow didn't get
The Belgians didn't accept him.
They threw him out of the mosque, actually.
Exactly. But, you know, this information does not come back to Spain. So there's definitely, you know, there are security failures, which is surprising because Spain is supposed to have a good track record on anti-terror networks. But as you say, it's this decentralization.
But they do have a good network. I mean, they've done comparatively good job for much longer than, you know, many other countries in Western Europe with fighting. I mean, they have. I mean,
well, you can't say that just because there haven't been incidents, because in fact, the jihadists were using Spain as a transit point, and they didn't want to mess up.
All right, we're going to pick up on that point. We have to take a very quick break. We'll be right back. Stay with us. You're watching The World This Week.
Morris, and I'm France 24's correspondent in Madrid. I'll bring you the latest news on Spain and Portugal, two countries battling to leave behind years of austerity. Join me live and check out my reports on France 24 and France24.com.
Sarah Morris, one of the 160 France 24 correspondents around the world.
Welcome back. Before we resume the France 24 debate, here are the France 24 debate. The World This Week. It's Friday. Before we resume it, let's tell you about some of the stories we're following for you in the newsroom. Thailand's former prime minister, a no-show on the day of her trial verdict. Authorities issuing an arrest warrant. Yingluck Shinawat's attorney claims she's suffering from an earache. No word on her whereabouts. Also in the news, deadly rioting in the northern Indian state of Haryana after the rape conviction of a cult leader who's due back in court on Monday for sentencing. In Afghanistan, special forces say the siege in a Kabul mosque is over. The latest suicide attack targeting Shiites, leaving at least 33 dead, including women and children, says our correspondent Bilal Sahrawi. And at the end of his tour of Central and Eastern Europe, Emmanuel Macron pointing the finger at Poland, saying it's marginalizing itself from the rest of the EU. Warsaw calling his remarks on low-cost hirings from other EU states, quote, arrogant. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's The World This Week. The World This Week in partnership with the Daily Beast. Foreign editor Christopher Dickey is with us. Welcome back as well to James McCauley of The Washington Post. Paris-based journalist Inti Landau is with us as well, and so is France24.com's Leila Jacinto. Leila, you were mentioning just before we went to the break about, we were talking about the attacks in Barcelona and nearby, and this imam who's at the heart of it all. an imam who is sent to jail for transporting hashish. And the question, obviously it's early days, we can only speculate at this point, of whether or not he was a drug dealer who became a radical or a radical for whom drug money was a means to an end.
Well, he's an overnight imam. And he, there's no vetting authority for imam. He declared himself an imam, but a lot of imams in the other mosques raised the alert about him. And also, when it comes to Spain, they have a very close link with Morocco. A lot of these Moroccan immigrants in Europe, and Belgium included, are descendants of people from the Rif. Rif is a region that it grows very good hashish, apparently, and so they have so the connection between the hashish smuggling. Now the radicalization is setting in, and you see all this happening. And Chris, you were talking about, Spain has long had radicalized people on the coast, and for a long time Spain was not touched, and we all thought it was because the jihadis were not going to touch Spain. It was good for them to operate in, but that's what happened in Brussels too, because for the longest time Belgium did not come under attack.
Actually one of the things that we've seen is as the ISIS hit teams, the first team, the varsity, gets taken out or stopped, they turn to the logistical networks and then get them to do the attacks themselves. That's what happened in Brussels, as a matter of fact. That was the logistical network for Paris. And then when Abdeslam was one of the members of the Paris network was arrested, they thought they were going to go, so they hit. And I think that's very much what happened.
Yeah, and on that note, I mean, I think it is a mistake to assume that, Islamic State officials don't sort of learn with each passing attack. And so in this case, this is not a story of people from the banlieue, in some sort of horrible circumstance, on the periphery of a great European city, sort of marginalized and taking out frustrated. That's not this case. So these young men mostly came from in and around this rather idyllic city in the Spanish side of the Pyrenees. I mean, it is a totally different setup, and I think that means something too, because it suggests a sort of a different working plan, with different sort of suspects involved.
I was talking to Scott Atran, who's an anthropologist who studies a lot of this very closely, and he was saying the question here is: was this directed from the top down, like say, Paris? Or was it a horizontal organization? And that's what's worrying a lot of people, is more and more horizontal organizations.
Exactly. And one questions we're also wondering is why, less than a week before the attack, there was this trip to Paris by several of them. The Paris prosecutor saying they stayed overnight in a hotel. They bought a camera in an appliance store. This Friday, French newspaper Le Parisien wondering if perhaps they weren't meeting someone important.
The thing, I think we have a lot of people actually planning terror attacks. The police are are following a lot of these people, and some of them are going through cracks and preparing attacks. And that's what we're seeing, that all these small networks are probably connected together. If you remember well the Thalys train attack, had I don't remember his name right now. The attacker was actually a Moroccan from Spain who had spent some time in France and then went to Belgium. So all these people are probably connected together. The police are probably following some of them, but not all of them. And that's what we are seeing now, that they are traveling, they are in touch with each other, probably not through the regular telephone, so not that easy to tap and follow.
All right, we're going to switch continents and look at what's going on in Venezuela with a thorn in President Maduro's side, the now former Attorney General, popping up in Brazil after escaping to Colombia. A one-time staunch supporter of the president's late predecessor, Hugo Chavez, Luisa Ortega came bearing what she says is, quote, a lot of evidence linking Maduro and his entourage to the same Odebrecht construction firm that's accused of bribing officials all over Latin America.
They have attempted to hide many incidences of corruption, of which I have a lot of proof. More concretely, the case of Odebrecht, that compromises many high Venezuelan officials. starting with the President of the Republic.
Teodoro, you're the former Caracas correspondent for the
in Bogota.
Bogota, excuse me, for the Wall Street Journal. What's your reaction when she says, "I have a lot of proof"?
Well, my reaction was not that clever from Maduro to go into a fight with your general attorney. That he has definitely a lot of evidence on everything that was going, all the murky businesses in the country.
What will it get her at this particular point in time? Now that he's railroaded the legislature and all of this, what are the consequences for him?
Well, legitimacy. He's losing legitimacy. Like his country his government is looking worse than ever. He right now supports himself through the army, but still, I mean,
it's a further chink.
Right, exactly. I mean, the boat is sinking and is sinking faster now.
Christopher Nicky, your reaction to the fresh sanctions that we're getting, an executive order by Donald Trump against Venezuela, will that help or hurt the cause of the Venezuelan people?
Well, look, the problem with sanctions is that when you have an authoritarian regime or a dictatorship, it essentially runs like a mafia. And the people suffer, but the authoritarian government does not. The people who are in power, they're the ones who can run the black market. In fact, the black market is a big way that Maduro stays in power right now. There's a double exchange rate, and he lets the military and his people use the official exchange rate while the actual currency is completely collapsed on the black market. So this is the kind of thing that may look good, it puts pressure, discredits him, more taking away his legitimacy, but he stays in power.
Okay,
and it could also backfire on another side is the other countries in Latin America. Since the beginning, Chavez and then Maduro have accused the U.S. of trying to topple them, but they had no evidence of it. The U.S. government never did anything against the Venezuelan government. Totally ignored all the...
Right, so it'll turn the rest of the region against the United States.
Well, and Trump said he would use military force.
That was pretty nasty. Because
that's pretty stupid.
It was pretty stupid because at that point, a lot of countries in Latin America were trying to put pressure on Venezuela. And after such a comment, you just refrain of siding with Trump. So he lost. I think he lost a good opportunity to keep quiet.
Okay.
As he always does.
Yeah. In Angola, it's not so much the results of the elections that are a surprise. The provisional tally, by the way, if you're keeping score, gives a landslide win to the ruling MPLA, despite protests from the opposition that the leaders there have run the economy into the ground. No, the surprise is that the former independence fighter, José Eduardo dos Santos, president of 38 years, wasn't on the ballot. The 74-year-old is the continent's second longest serving leader, 38 years in power, Lila Jacinto. But he's not really going away yet. He's still going to be the chair of the ruling MPLA.
This is true, because he's going to still be the leader of the, exactly, and so can wield tremendous power. But in the context of Angola, a country that has seen decades of civil war and then a one-party domination, and by the Dos Santos family, just the signal that there's not a Dos Santos in power and that he did not choose, because the presidential candidate was actually an anointed candidate, but at least it was not a family member. And Angola for now does not, stand in the ranks of Africa's longest serving leaders. So yes, I mean, it's still a long way to go. But I mean, what pushed this was that Dos Santos did not really have that much of an option. There was intense pressure on him to step down. The falling oil prices also helped that. So, in a continent where a number of presidents have changed the constitution and, they're
He's stepping
their term
aside.
Limits. Yeah.
He's stepping aside, but his daughter runs the state oil firm. His son, the sovereign wealth fund. Are they going away too?
No. Nobody expects it. It's kind of like everybody, Saleh's still in Yemen, when you have...
Well, but on the other hand, the new president could, once he has the power, could fire them.
Yes,
the son and the daughter.
But from what I'm hearing is this new president does not really seem to have too much teeth. So there's not that much hope on him. Just they're happy for now.
You never know.
Somebody who's showing a bit of teeth this Friday is the president of France, Emmanuel Macron, whose popularity, by the way, is being tested at home, most notably over plans to loosen labor laws. It's no surprise he's been a bit of a barnstorming tour this week, concluding in Bulgaria, as he aims to convince fellow EU leaders to halve the 24-month limit that's currently on the books for paying posted workers. Those are lower-cut wages and benefits that they get, the same rates that they get back in their home nations for doing work abroad in other EU states. Most countries agreeing, most except Hungary, and in particular, Poland.
Europe is a place built on values, on democracy and civil liberties, which today Poland is violating. This country has decided to remain in the sidelines of Europe's history, its present and its future. I regret this, but it's my firm belief that the Polish people deserve better. I think the Prime Minister, as well as her government, will have a lot of trouble explaining that it's right for Poles to be poorly paid in Poland and in the rest of Europe, and that this is what lies ahead for them.
We talked about Donald Trump's issues with diplomacy. The Polish Prime Minister answering in kind that this is hardly diplomatic, that it's arrogant, and shows his lack of experience.
Well, we will certainly see sort of how this unfolds. I think it's very interesting. So on the campaign, Macron commentators would point out how his favorite phrase was, en même temps, at the same time, by the same token. And here you have the president of France being a sort of an advocate for the French working man. In Eastern Europe, seeking to curb the flow of these workers. But then, he's poised to come back home and sort of do these reforms, which are not sort of, in the eyes of the French working man, things that they would really like to see. So I'm not really sure who exactly this is serving and sort of what addition this gives Macron, these antics on the European stage, at least.
Well, and I think that those comments from Macron also show how sometimes French politicians forget that other European countries also have domestic politics and domestic issues. So you can, I remember that whole debate about tax harmonization and how the French were wanting other countries in the European Union to raise their tax rates, forgetting that actually some countries are very happy to have low tax rates like Ireland, and I think it's about the same. Obviously, the French don't like to have.
But he did hang on. But on this trip, he did manage to convince Slovakia, the Czech Republic, to agree to his reform. He's really down to two countries, it seems, that are dead set against it.
Right, but I don't think the right way to do it is with that sort of comments to convince the Poles. Or maybe I'm wrong.
No, I think, well, first of all, I think he's dealing with the government. Let's look at the government in Poland. I mean, it is cracking down on the press. It is stacking the Supreme Court, the courts. It is basically becoming an authoritarian government, and it is increasingly an outlier in the European Union. So you say to them, oh, you want to do all that? You don't want to play ball with the European Union, but you want to keep 24 months of posted workers with these regulations? No, I'm sorry. So this was partly a screw you to Poland. Yes, openly, overtly. You couldn't make it more obviously than he made it. Also in terms of the
these weren't off-the-cuff remarks. He obviously...
No, it's not like Trump. He knows exactly what he's saying. And he wanted to make it clear to the French that he was doing this, and to the French workers too. You're right. It's not despite what he's doing with the labor code that he does this. It's precisely because of what he's doing with the labor code. It's to say, yes, I'm going to liberalize the labor code, but no, I'm not going to have these posted workers coming in from Poland. And if Poland doesn't want to play this game, if they don't want to play like they're on the European team, then to hell with them.
I think that's true. I don't disagree, but I think we also have to take into account a similar sort of lack of diplomacy vis-a-vis the Italians, who are not the Polish or the Hungarians on the European stage, and so it's only been a month since the whole shipyard debacle and sort of all of that, and that to me, that's interesting.
Over the nationalization
exactly
of shipyards in France,
I
the
think,
Italians wanted to buy.
And it begs the question, during the campaign, it was all, c'est l'Europe qui nous protège, this whole thing about Europe being the sort of the end goal that we need to preserve. But then I think what we're starting to see is a French president become a French president and not a sort of European avatar.
Well, I think he's incredibly arrogant, and I think he doesn't just want to be the French president. He wants to be the undisputed leader of Europe.
Or the free world, perhaps.
That's probably the world, but certainly of Europe. No, I think that's Jupiter. I mean, this is his Jupiter complex. I think there's no question about this. But unlike Donald Trump, this guy actually knows what he's doing, and he very closely considers what he's doing. In terms of the shipbuilding, the shipyard, you couldn't have a situation where the Italians were going to close down that shipyard and take all those jobs away and then say, I'm going to liberalize the employment regulations in France. You have to show that you care about French workers. Otherwise, you can't get anywhere. We are going to have hell to pay next month in this country, no matter what he does. But if he doesn't...
Because strikes have been called by unions against his labor reform.
But if he doesn't take some clear measures defending French workers, then he won't have any leg to stand on.
By the way, Macron's charm offensive, including what some might argue is his most potent asset, his wife, Brigitte. Here they're in the company of their Romanian hosts. This was on Thursday, her first outing abroad since the French government dropped the idea of giving a first lady status, like in the United States. We can also show images of them visiting Bucharest's Village Life Museum. There they are. You see Brigitte Macron and Carmen Ioannis enjoying the traditional garb while and music while the menfolk walk behind. Lila Jacinto, your thoughts on the presidential couple in France these days?
Did you say that they did not give her a
They didn't give her a special status.
My thoughts, well, it's an old story, so fine, I do not understand, frankly, why do we have to waste time on the First Lady? And I salute the French for not having an official title. It was interesting. It was an interesting story on the campaign trail. Of course, she being much older than him, his teacher, but this is just the fun and games.
It's just fun and games?
Well, no, I don't think so. I mean, I think you can see when he talks about her. I mean, he is very wrapped up in this woman. She is his muse, his inspiration, his advisor. She is a lot of things to him. And I think that he wanted to officialize that in some way.
And she's an attraction when they go to places like Romania.
Definitely. People like her everywhere. I mean, it's interesting because it's not the first time. I mean, every French president, Sarkozy or François Hollande, had their spouse, even though partner. But I mean,
this looks like a little happier than both of them. I mean,
right? No, but definitely they both tried to put her, or intended to put their second half on the stage
until they had another second half.
Right, exactly. But even François Hollande tried at the beginning.
At the same time, I mean, she's popular, but I mean, at the same time, like 300,000 plus people signed this petition that said, no, we do not want Brigitte Macron to have a special title and a separate budget outside of what she's already given as part of the Élysée. Right, which is already substantial. And like that means something. I mean, 300,000 plus signatures is not nothing. That's bigger than some French cities. So, I don't know.
Yeah, but isn't that, I mean, there is just this basic screw you mentality about authority in France, and that's a real easy one. Yeah. To sort of say, oh, well, also, don't you think it was more than a little sexist to go after her with a petition? Why not go after him with a petition?
I think this boils down to the French la vie privée, which is a president's private life is private, and, we elect the president. But, first ladies, I remember when Sarkozy went to India, and on every Indian panel, I had to talk about Carla, So, of course...
All right, so let's talk about that. So you had to talk about Carla Bruni on every panel. Carla Bruni, in that case, becomes, you could say, an ambassador for the nation of France. So therefore, maybe her status should be officialized.
Well, what about François Hollande? He did not have an official wife. He had a girlfriend who he cheated on.
The girlfriend, well, he cheated on her, but before it was known...
Publicly.
Before it was known, she acted as a first lady, as Brigitte Macron, or she did some sort of inaugurations, some...
Right, and every time...
Charity activities.
And in our newsroom, where we have an English desk and a French desk, we are constantly coming up with this, with the French desk resolutely saying, no, it's not a story, it's his private life. And the, and the Anglo desk saying, excuse me, he's cheated, So I think this is what it comes down to. The French believe that they have elected a leader and that's his partner. And
therefore 300,000 French people should sign a petition saying that they shouldn't officialize Brigitte Macron's position?
I think what they're opposing is the sort of Americanization of French politics.
Is that what the petition said?
But on the other hand, I think there is a lot of requests.
Brigitte Macron does not have a position. She is just the spouse of the person who was elected to be president, right? So what position is this?
I think maybe they just want to leave it open to mistresses, which is what we had with Hollande.
Right. And it's on that note that we will conclude. Thank you, Christopher Dickey. I want to thank Asala Intila and Dara James Macaulay, Leela Jacinto. Stay with us, though. Our Media Watch segment is next. And we say hello to Nadia Massi.
Hello.
So we were talking there about the French president and his wife's status, but that's not the only story making news in France this week.
That's right. People have long focused on the way that Brigitte Macron looks, but perhaps less on Emmanuel Macron himself. That is until today, where Le Point has broken the story that Emmanuel Macron has spent in his first 3 months in office 26,000 euros on his makeup. That's 8,700 in 1 month.
On his makeup?
On his makeup alone. Nothing to do with Brigitte. Now, that figure's broken down into two bills. We've got 16,000 and 10,000, which has been billed by his personal makeup artist, known mysteriously only as Natasha M. Now, his aides have been very quick to respond to all of this. They've conceded, yes, this is a very high number, but they said it's only because it's his first 3 months. He had to make a lot of foreign trips. He and his makeup artist were flying all over the world together, but they insist that number is coming down. Nonetheless, obviously, this has provoked many jokes online on Twitter, much of them at the president's expense. Let's see if I can find my mouse moving. It's not moving.
It doesn't want you to say disparaging things about that.
There we go. Funnily enough.
There we go.
There he is. And to someone marking the president's attempts to put on lipstick. And let's face it, you know you're in trouble when you have the word gate affixed to the end of your scandal. Here we have maquillage gate in English. That is, of course, makeup gate. And no surprises for guessing who his face has been spliced with here. Another president who is perhaps quite concerned with the way that he looks as well. Now, indeed, we have another Twitter user here who said, well, perhaps Macron's new slogan should be make makeup great again. Again, another allusion to President Donald Trump. Others, they've got a more political message here. We've got this one that says the CAC 40, the French stock market, has been taken away by French workers. This is obviously by a supporter of Jean-Luc Mélenchon, the French far left leader.
So tar and feathered is the makeup they want for him.
Exactly, that's the one. Lots of people pointing to the description that his aides use as the makeup artist as a contractor. People saying, well, this is really the perfect articulation that Emmanuel Macron is, of course, this big neoliberal figure. That's what we've got in this tweet here. And I've got Karl Remarks, the satirist, who said, this makes me think that Macron's barely even a real person. He says, this looks like an elaborate, ironic, postmodern fable. But keen media watchers, or indeed people in the room, may remember that Macron's not the worst offender here. Of course, back in the last presidency, Francois Hollande spent reportedly anywhere between 7,000 and 11,000 euros every month on his hair, which meant that he was dubbed not a champagne socialist, but, wait for it, a shampoo socialist. And there you are.
Okay. Another story you've been following is, get this, President Trump has been taking to Twitter.
I know, what a moment. President Trump's been taking to Twitter, but it's not quite as simple as that. What we're looking at today actually is quite a subtle Twitter war which is ongoing between President Trump and Senator Marco Rubio, who ran against him in the Republican...
A subtle Twitter war.
It is a subtle Twitter war because some people say maybe it's not a Twitter war at all. Now, what's been happening is Trump will tweet something offensive or bold or whatever, and Rubio will respond by tweeting a line from the Bible. So here's the latest from today. This has been happening for months now. We've got Trump saying few, if any, administrations have done more in 7 months than the Trump administration. Bills passed, regulations killed, border, military, ISIS, Security Council. Half an hour later, we get Rubio, who says, by patience is a ruler persuaded, and a soft tongue can break a bone. Now that's from Proverbs 25:15. So there've been multiple examples going on like this over the past month. Plenty of people saying that Rubio is subtly calling out Trump, but doesn't quite have the guts to do it in public. We've got one tweeter today saying that precisely. He says, talking of patience and soft tongue, when are you actually going to call out Trump for who he is, Marco?
All right. Well, we'll leave it. We'll leave it there, and we'll see whether or not. What was the phrase used on the campaign trail? Little Marco, was that when they were fighting one another?
Yeah.
Nadia Massi, I want to thank you. I want to thank our panel. By the way, after the show, do join us on Facebook, a Facebook Live, with our panelists. We'll be talking about the 20th anniversary that's coming up next week, the death of Princess Diana. Thank you for joining us here in The World This Week.